Good afternoon. My guest today has asked more questions in the House of Lords than I have had hot dinners. So let's turn the tables on him and ask him a few. Lord Brockway, welcome. First of all, you brought out this big, but very clear, I might say, book called The Colonial Revolution on your 85th birthday.
That is so, yes.
Is there going to be a sequel on your 95th?
Well, I'm under contract to do one for my 90th birthday.
I think everybody's curious the moment they meet you, because you look very healthy and you are very active. And what is the secret at 85?
I'm not sure, dear. My family are long-lived, but I haven't any secret, really.
Nothing about your diet? Nothing about keeping fit?
No, I'm a vegetarian, but I doubt whether that has anything to do with it. I've reached an age where I like liquids more than solids, so I'm not very cautious about my diet.
Do you feel that there's something about people, though, that remain in themselves active that keeps them young? I mean, some inner sort of
I think
enthusiasm.
Probably so. I can't describe it. It's within me, and I must just do it.
Mm. In fact, when you've had a very political, active life like you have had, you must have survived quite a few enemies. And in fact, I read somewhere, didn't I, that you'd once been threatened with your life?
Oh, a few, but I don't remember them. As a matter of fact, Harold Wilson had to remind me of that particular one. We had late sittings at the House of Commons, and he used to take a number of us home in his car, Barbara Castle and others who lived in North London. And he dropped me at home at 3 o'clock one morning. 6 o'clock in the morning, my wife got me out of bed and said, "Someone has travelled all the way from Devon to see you." And I put on my dressing gown and saw him. And he put some questions to me about my attitude about Kenya. And then after 3 minutes, he pulled a revolver from his pocket and he said, "I'd come to shoot you, but I don't think you're worth hanging for." And he left me. Oh, there have been others.
Do you think that you've got an attitude that tries to find the best in people? Or do you, I mean, have you got a kind of basic approach to people which is that they are nice rather than nasty?
Well, generally, I trust people. And quite honestly, over the long years, I have found that it's been very rare when people have not justified that trust. Mm. And I believe if you seek trust in people, they respond.
Mm. Shall we go back over your long life, in fact, to its beginning? And what were your parents?
Not only my parents, but my grandparents. My whole family for 3 generations. Uncles, aunts, sister, have all been missionaries, either in Africa, Madagascar, India, China. And I suppose that's the background. And though I'm a humanist, I think probably that their devotion and identity with peoples of Africa and Asia have led me to feel that identity as well, though in a different way.
But you never wanted to become a missionary yourself?
No, I became a humanist. I don't accept church theology. And yet I believe tremendously in spiritual things. Mm. I'm not an atheist. Mm. I'm an agnostic. I just don't know. And I think if there is an afterlife, the best way to prepare for it is to try to serve people in this life. Mm. Well, I don't want to appear too good.
In fact, when you were, with your parents, missionaries in a way, did that mean that you were brought up without them? I mean, did you see much of your parents?
No, that is a drawback of missionary life. I didn't see a great deal of them.
Do you regret?
Unhappily, my mother developed heart disease. In the last 6 months of her life, I came very near to her, and she was very beautiful. But it's one of the drawbacks of missionary life, that if they are serving in a country where it is not healthy for children to be brought up, then they're separated. Mm. I was only 4 when I came from India, though I have very vivid memories of it.
Mm. Do you think that's where you got your terrific enthusiasm for colonialism, that is anti-colonialism?
I think so, but this is strange. It's a matter of 2 generations. My father goes to India as a young radical. The longer he's there, the more imperialist he becomes. My sister, I hope she'll forgive me for saying this, goes to India rather doubtful about my views. But when she finishes her long career there, she sympathizes with my views very considerably.
Mm. Can you remember what made you start to get interested in politics?
I don't quite know. I was always a rebel.
What, at school you were you?
Oh, even before, dear. I remember my grandfather, who was manager of Lord Burton's estate in Rangemore, was very establishment, Church of England. And my parents were nonconformist. And when he insisted on my going to a Church of England school and I wanted to go to a chapel, I remember lying in bed singing Dare to be a Daniel rather than go to church at all. So I've always been a rebel.
So, but can you think of what in fact led you to politics in particular?
Well, at school, I don't know what led it to me, but I became a young radical. The Reformers' Yearbook was my Bible. Winston Churchill and Lloyd George were my heroes. I remember standing in front of a mirror and trying to repeat on my forehead the 2 lines down Churchill's face. And I became very closely associated with Churchill.
Even though you were on opposite sides of the party fence, so to speak.
Well, when he left the Liberals and before he joined the Tories, he stood as a candidate at Westminster, and I was the Socialist candidate. And at the count, Brendan Bracken, who was his agent, came running up to him and said, "You're in by 43 votes. And Mrs. Churchill put her arm round his shoulder to kiss him. And then Brendan Bracken said, "I'm sorry, sir, you're out by 43 votes. And Churchill stamped up and down Caxton Hall like an angry tiger. And then he came and stood by me for the announcement. And he said, "Fenner, this election has been too short. In 10 days, the machine has defeated ideas. If it had lasted 3 days more, ideas would have triumphed, and either you or I would have been elected." Oh, so's Churchillian.
Now that at that time you weren't a socialist, were you?
Well, when I stood against Churchill, I was
You were,
a socialist.
but before that you weren't, were
Oh,
you?
no, I began with being a young radical, a young liberal. I was a liberal sub-agent in 1906 at Tunbridge Wells and the Tunbridge Division, the only time that the Conservative has ever been defeated in that division.
Do you know why you became a socialist?
Yes, dear. I got a journalistic job in London. Well, I was only 19 or 20. I lived in the settlement, and the appalling poverty there made me a socialist.
A settlement, did you say?
Yes. It was Claremont in Islington.
What, like communes today?
Well,
Because it sounds a very modern idea so long ago, if you pardon me saying so.
What? Oh,
To
no,
live in a settlement.
Oh, no, this was a religious settlement, dear. And as a matter of fact, when I was adopted as a socialist candidate for the local council on my 21st birthday, the heads of the settlement said that a socialist candidate couldn't possibly live there. So I left and joined 12 young people, and we all lived together as a commune. And socialism was our religion, our way of life.
Do you have a feeling, I mean, again, I've got a recollection of this, of having read you saying it, I believe, that you feel that you, at your age, are closer to young people today than the middle-aged of today are?
Yes, dear, I wouldn't say that of you.
Thank you very much.
But I think those of us who are 70 and 80 lived so much through the same experience as young people are today that we understand them more than the people who are 40 and 50.
Can I go back again over your career? And there was one part of it which was that you were a conscientious objector in the First World War.
Yes.
Now, as a socialist, this must have been quite tough because you really are going to come across quite nasty references to yourself from your fellow workers, aren't you?
Oh, very often. Honestly, I never remember the disagreeable things of life very much.
Well, your house was full of swastikas at one point, wasn't it?
Oh,
and
much
things like
later,
that.
much later, dear. That was for a different reason. My house was covered with swastikas with the slogan, "Keep Britain White."
Oh, I see. That was a different thing, was it?
Completely different. But during the First World War, yes, we had white feathers given to us, and we were a bit isolated. I remember being rescued from a meeting where I was attacked. But those things aren't in my mind much, dear.
But you, at that point, you felt very strongly that war was wrong, or that that particular war was wrong.
I'm not sure that I felt... Yes, I felt strongly. I hadn't worked out a philosophy. Later on, I went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and I gave up my absolute pacifism. I wasn't an absolute pacifist in the Second World War against Hitler. I think it would have been a disaster to the world if Hitler had won.
When you then became, I mean, you got interested in the anti-colonialism, do you think that there you could see a way in which you could fight imperialism? If not, I mean, how could you do it without violence?
Well, I think Gandhi showed that it could be done. And I had a great admiration for Gandhi, and I would always prefer his methods to be followed. But Gandhi himself said he would rather have a slave resist his slavery by violence than acquiesce in it. And reluctantly I accept violence as the inevitable alternative. I think it'll be inevitable in southern Africa.
In fact, I mean, when you first had your strong views about imperialism, you were almost regarded as a crackpot, weren't you? You know, that this was the most amazing lot of ideas that you had. And of course, nowadays, this has become quite acceptable.
Yes, dear. I was suspended from the House of Commons for my protesting against the arrest of Gandhi and of Nehru and the suppression of the Indian National Congress. I was almost alone then. But it's won through.
Now then, why do you think it has won through? Do you think that people have changed in their attitude to other people, or do you think it's just...
Oh, mostly events, dear. Partly the opposition that grew up in this country to colonialism, partly to the resistance in colonialist countries themselves, but mostly to events, which was reflected in Macmillan's speech about the wind of change.
When you objected to imperialism so early a time ago, what were you objecting to, really?
Oh, the idea that any one people should assume the right to determine the pattern of life of another people.
But say, I mean, let's put the case for sort of, say, a so-called good imperialist point of view, which was to say, a backward country, let's make it richer. We know of a better way of life than those people. This is what some imperialists would say, wouldn't they?
Oh, and there's some truth in it, dear. I regard colonialism as a part of the process of history. Health, education, though very inadequate, roads, development of industries, particularly the conquering of malaria and even of plague. I mean, all that's a contribution. But don't take the view that that was the real motive of imperialism. The real motive was to extract from those peoples the foodstuffs, the raw materials we needed, leaving them with imbalanced economies now, and aggravating the poverty which was already there.
But you see, then, having taken over a country, we leave the sort of so-called underdog to fend for himself suddenly, don't we?
Very much so. And I'm disappointed in what's happened in many African countries. There have been 19 coups in the independent nations. On the other hand, magnificent examples like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. But if you compare what's happening in Africa with what happened in Europe during the similar stage of changing from empires to nations, the violence, the persecution in Africa is nothing compared with the violence and persecution and physical revolution which there was in Europe in that period. So I'm hopeful about the future.
But you're not happy about the state of affairs in Africa, are you? I mean, General Amin and...
Very, very often not. Not about General Amin. I think Nkrumah was a great example of it. Oh, he was nearly my son in my affections. I was with him when he decided to go back to Ghana when he was a student here. We used to walk arm in arm and talk together in Ghana. But in his last days, he was imprisoning political opponents. I remember seeing him the last time in a lonely room at the top of Christianborg Castle, narrow staircases, narrow passages, and finding him a lonely and fearful man. And I said to him, you shouldn't imprison these political opponents. They are not a physical danger to you. And he said, some must suffer as innocent as well as the guilty. And I said, you're making our job in England very difficult. He says, Fenner, I'm afraid you may be one of the innocent victims as well. Those were the last words he said to me.
Do you have a bit of dismay about us in this country and the way we treat coloured people?
Yes, dear. I introduced the bill against racial discrimination. I had to introduce it 9 years in succession before it was adopted. It's now the law. But though it is the law, racial feeling, colour feeling, always deep and almost instinctive in many people. And it will take some time to conquer. I think it will be conquered.
Do you think in some ways, I mean, I can remember my grandmother having a great fear of foreigners. I mean, she included the English in that, by the way. But she used to sort of really be frightened, I think. Now, in some ways, I think, do you think that this is what people feel about people that are not exactly the same as themselves?
Oh, sure, dear. It's the fact of being strange. I was Member of Parliament for Slough, and there we had the problem of immigrants. But the feeling against the Welsh who came to Slough was as great as it is against the coloured immigrants. You had notices in windows of people advertising lodgings, and no Welsh.
What did they expect us to do, I wonder?
Oh, are you Welsh too?
I'm Welsh, Lord Brockway, or can I call you Fenner?
Please, dear, much rather. I hate being called Lord.
Do you?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question which leads straight from that, in fact, which is that there you are, a very straightforward person by the seeming of you, and you've never taken on office, have you?
Never wanted to, dear.
Do you know why you didn't, by the way?
Oh, yes. I respect those who take office, but it inevitably means compromise. And I've just wanted to have the freedom to express my own views. And therefore, I've never wanted a political career in that sense or an office.
But do you think you might have achieved more inside an office?
It's always a question mark. No, I doubt it. I think some people could. I think people with my temperament probably gain more by an independent attitude. I mean, there I am in the House of Lords now.
That's the question I was beginning to ask when I got sidetracked in my mind.
Yeah.
I was going to say to you that as a socialist and a straightforward person in that sense, is the pomp of the House of Lords something that stifles you a little?
Doesn't stifle me, dear. I just don't accept it. I mean, for example, when Her Majesty opens Parliament, she has to open it from the House of Lords, as she's not allowed in the House of Commons since the days of Charles I. Everyone has to be robed. Well, I walked in without robes like this, and they couldn't turn me out. So I've no wish to be spectacular about it, and I just don't go now on those occasions.
But you made that one stand, and then you'll stay away at that point, rather than be tactless about it, so to speak, and do it. Yes. But do you see a great merit in the House of Lords?
A merit, yes, in this sense. I think our debates are very often better than in the Commons, partly because there isn't the same bitter partisan spirit, partly because those who speak very often have great experience, knowledge of the subjects about which they speak. And it's of value in that sense. I've come to the view that there should be a second chamber for revising purposes, though without any permanent powers of legislation. I'd abolish hereditary peers.
You would? Why?
Well, I don't believe that someone should be a member of a legislature just because he's the son of a father. And I would have a second chamber which was representative.
I keep on trying to imagine you, and I can very easily, at school. What were you interested in at school?
I was a very bad boy.
I just had a feeling you might have been a very bad boy.
I only had two interests, and this will rather surprise you. One was breeding racing pigeons, and the other was rugby football. I had a pigeon which won the race from Boulogne to London when I was still at school. I called it Happy. Do you know, Happy fell down outside my window last year.
But Happy, your pigeon?
I don't mean
No.
my pigeon, but just like, beautiful racing red homing pigeon. And it had hurt its wing. I nursed it for 3 weeks. I found it was being raced from Spain to Burton-on-Trent. How a pigeon finds its way all the way from Spain to a little loft in Burton-on-Trent, I don't know. But after 3 weeks, it flew to Burton-on-Trent. But they tell me they can never race it from the south again.
Why?
Because it would always come to me on the way.
My father had a great admiration for pigeons. He kept
Yeah.
them too. And he used to say if only he could fathom out the homing instinct, he'd have the secret of a lot of things, is what he reckoned.
I know.
Is there anything you would have particularly liked to have achieved, looking back over your 85 years?
I don't know, dear. I'm concerned in racial equality. I'm more concerned, perhaps than anything else, in peace in the world. And neither of those things have yet been achieved.
Can you think of things that you'd imagine would make peace in the world easier to come by? I mean, what would be the kind of policy that you'd think that could bring that about?
I think we've got to become international in attitude. It's a shriveling world, smaller and smaller. You and I are talking now. While we're talking, they're probably looking at us in Australia and listening to us. We're becoming a smaller world. But while we're becoming a smaller world, antagonisms between groups of nations and between nations, between races, seems just as strong as ever.
But are you optimistic about the future?
Oh, yes, dear. Yes. Particularly because of youth, the new generation. In every country in the world, growing numbers of youth are throwing aside the old ideas, the old values. War is impossible for them.
We've come to the end of our programme, and I want to thank you very much, because it's very nice to have met a utopian in real life. Thank you very
dear,
much.
the utopian today is the realist tomorrow.